Hello, everyone, and welcome to, let me just check if it's recording. It is recording. Welcome to our week one lecture on theory in international relations. So I apologize too. I only just realized after finishing my introductory lecture that the video of my face didn't come up. So you were spared looking at my face for that 30 minutes to 40 minutes or so, but now I've got my floating head up there. So hopefully you'll be able to see this now on the lectures going forward. I haven't used Zoom for a few months and totally forgot how it works. So which I think is a nice problem to have. So this lecture is on theory in international relations. Like I mentioned at the end of our introduction, I think a lot of students, even academics and definitely practitioners, um, may have a big sigh, or exacerbation when they think of theory. It's something that's abstract, it's something that's not applicable, it's not relevant, it's just a bit of like, wishy-washy things, doesn't have any real world applicability. My purpose in this particular lecture, and even this week, and dare I say in this entire course, is to change your perception here and to demonstrate to you that theory is not only incredibly important for understanding international relations in any capacity, but is also something that informs our everyday outlook on life. So you can't actually escape theory and the implications of theory as much as many of us would like to. So I really want to try to make theory relevant for you and make it interesting and go a little bit more detail into some of these theories that you may have heard of before, but approach them in maybe a little bit of a different way and yeah, make them more relevant to you. And I think for this course too, the theory component will be very much needed because not only in each week will we be talking about how different theories apply to the problems we'll be addressing, but also your assignments and well, your group assignment as well as your individual presentation will need to address theory. Even though, and again, this is something I'll obviously talk to you a lot more about in the subsequent weeks, even though normally policy briefs that you may have done before wouldn't use a lot of theory, this is a little bit different for this unit where you'll be expected to integrate at least a little bit of theory into your policy brief, even if it's not a huge amount. So with that, let's start off. If I can progress the slides, there we go. So these are our learning objectives for today. We want to understand, what the point of theory is. Like, why do we bother? Why does it always come up week one for every international relations course? I want to show you why is it important. And to be quite honest, if this was, if I was in charge of the university, if we ever see that awful day, I'd be making sure like theories encompass a much larger parts of international relations courses. And really, ideally, you should be having entire courses which are just about theory because, the 10, 15 minutes that I might talk about feminism or liberalism or whatever it might be is nowhere near enough detail to really understand it in sufficient depth. So I want to kind of give you a bit of a taste of these and a bit of a more advanced taste as well. And also encourage you guys to read more. And with like anything, and especially for theory this week, if there's things that like interest you, you want to learn more about, like feel free to approach me and ask, and I'd love to try to point you in the right direction. We're very lucky. We've got a very a good library, a lot of resources you can access. There's a lot of things to satiate your intellectual appetite. So anyway, that's learning objective one. Learning objective two, we want to interrogate these mainstream and critical theories in IR. So this is kind of where the more advanced aspect comes in. It's not just understanding building blocks, which I think from my experience of other international relations courses here at Monash, have done very briefly and superficially. So we're going to go more into the fundamentals in a lot deeper level, but then also touch on the advanced aspects of it. So when we say interrogate, I mean to critique these theories and think about them in an imminent way. So this isn't critiquing them from like the outside, saying like, oh, this theory is bad because I don't like it because it doesn't do these things that this other theory says it should, or It's not from an external perspective, but we want to give an immanent critique, which is a critique of these theories based on their own goals. So if you have a theory that posits or says that it does something, we're going to assess, like, does it do that thing? Does it say what it sets out to do, for example. So we're going to critique it from its own internal logic, okay? This is a much more elegant way of critiquing theories and ideas, not from external measures or external standpoints, but within the theory itself, okay? And then finally, applying mainstream and critical theories in IR is probably more the learning objective of this entire unit, but we're going to at least have the building blocks of it in this week. Now, this week's required readings, I've listed the 3 there. This is, I think, on balance, maybe one of the weeks with a higher reading load. Actually, maybe not, but there's a few here, but all of them are reasonably short pieces, and I hope are interested, written accessible level. This first one by Devitak and True, this is a broad introduction to theories from a very recent book, and it's a really nice introduction, which goes towards that aspect of, like, how do we critique theories? So look out for that in that introductory text. The second one looks more at Marxism and goes also into its, like, subsets. And one of the things that I will talk about in this lecture too, because Marxism forms a major part of critical theory, is to convince you to take Marxism seriously. You don't have to be a Marxist to use the huge amount of works that is under the umbrella of so-called Marxism. You don't have to be, politically inclined to socialism or whatever it might be. But I want to demonstrate to you why Marx and the scholars, many, many scholars who have come in that tradition, which is a very wide and diverse tradition, have some really important and interesting things to say about IR, but also, if you don't agree with them, they're a very good basis to start your critique, okay? So I think for any international relations scholar, practitioner, whoever you might be, Marxism provides a very important foundation for your own theory and your own outlook, whether you know about it or not, okay? So try not to be discouraged by the term Marxism, which I know sometimes elicits groans, especially if someone doesn't feel, inclined towards the political ramifications that might come with that. But it is a very, very powerful way of seeing the world. And it's not in the way you were probably taught about in undergrad. So we're going to go into that in a lot more detail, which is very different, I think, to what you've seen before. Finally, the Feminist Theorizing International Relations Discipline is a really nice article which goes into the historical development of feminism in IR, which will then provide a nice platform for talking more about feminism in international relations theory, especially in the workshops. So in terms of these required readings, the first one is a really nice just introduction, which we probably won't actually go into in a lot of detail in the workshops, but the other 2 are the ones that are going to form the basis of our book club. So these are really important. They're the harder ones, but that you have a go at reading them. So let's get into actually discussing what theory is. So theory is a view of the world, right? It's how we see what is out there, how we understand what is out there. It's about conception. It's like building a conceptual apparatus of the world at large. This is what theory is, okay? It's nothing more complex than that. So based on that, we all have a theory, right? Everyone who walks around, whether you're an international relations student, scholar, or otherwise, you're just a regular everyday person, you have a theory about how the world works. What we need to do as scholars, as practitioners, is have an understanding of that, right? Most people have theories, they have an idea about how the world works, but they just don't know it, okay? They're not able to reflect and conceptualize their own outlook. So the whole purpose of this school of study, right, is to actually interrogate our own theories, understand what they are, develop them, make them more sophisticated, and then also change them. If the circumstances require it, if, history requires it, our own personal development catalyze it, we have to be able to understand our theories to then change it. And finally, once we understand our theories and how we see the world, we can apply them to try to change the world. Okay, this is the main idea of what theory is. It's not just something that you think about abstractly and disconnected, and you read books about, and to appear aloof and clever. Like, theories is as everyday as eating pie. Okay, everyone has a theory. And so we're going to go into exactly what a theory is. And I mean, for me, and there's a lot of different definitions of what theory is, and I think that first reading by Devidak and True goes into a few different definitions of it, which I think is really, really useful for you to have a look and reflect upon. For me, I think there's two kind of major components of what makes up a theory. This is what known as ontology or epistemology, right? So ontology is referring to, what is there in the world? So when we look at the world and try to see things in front of us, or, if international relations scholar, we might see the international relations system, we might be looking outside the window, we might be thinking about social conflicts in our family, for example, what is it we're looking at? Okay, so what is there? So this includes things like seeing the world and thinking about that, like, ideas are important. So when we look at international relations, we think norms or ideas are the driving force, perhaps. Okay, so this is an ontological basis of looking at the world, which is constitutive of constructivism, right? When you look at the world, you see like ideas and norms as important. So that's kind of a constructivist way of looking at it. And that's their ontological basis, by looking at ideas. Another ontology, and probably one of the more common ones, is that of materialism. So if anyone here has studied natural sciences, whether it's chemistry, physics, or biology, materialism is what informs the ontological outlook of the natural sciences, that everything around us is made of material. So, at its very basis, it's like we're all atoms joined together, right? So this is a materialist basis of looking at things. Now, in social sciences, we call that way of understanding materialism as, maybe an unfair way of saying it, is vulgar materialism. If you're a social scientist and you see things as just made of stuff like matter, then you're called a vulgar materialist, because you just see, just bits of flesh and atoms and molecules stuck together as, our reality. But materialism usually in social sciences means actually something a lot different. Okay, so materialism relates to usually one of two things, and it does depend on the particular school or theory, what that is, and we'll talk about that soon. But it either relates to what's called like production. Okay, so how things are produced. So when you say in social sciences, there's material concerns, or if we have a material outlook, we're concerned about how we make things for everyday life. So this involves like how we produce food, how we earn wages, which is a particular social construct about, current society, but is required for producing things, right? Or to have the resources to make things. And it's how we actually create materials for living, right? So this is kind of where the materialism comes in. So when we think about materialism in social sciences, it's usually about, well, one strand of it is about production. So how do we produce things? Who gets to produce things? Who gets to decide? Who gets to control? These are, when you're looking at the world, when we have a materialist ontology, this is the questions and the things we're concerned about. One of the other aspects of materialism is that of reproduction. So we have production, which is like making things, to put it most basically. Reproduction is reproducing ourselves every day. So again, this relates very closely to production, because we have to make things that keep us alive, whether it's like food or clothes or, houses or whatever it might be. But then reproduction actually goes to what is the kind of foundations of us being able to go to sleep and then get up and then do the production thing successfully. So this goes more towards questions of relations between people. So having emotional relations, having friendships, having love relationships, familial relationships that give us the kind of fulfillment to be able to get up and go and do things that we need to, and as well as the kind of hidden labor that isn't always spoken about. And this is very much a concern of feminism, which is thinking about, well, who's doing the housework, who's doing the cooking, who's doing the child rearing, and those things that are actually allowing us to produce things, right? So just because, for instance, you might go to, your hospitality job and make things and coffees and food for people, for example. I'm just saying this because I used to do a lot of hospitality work. There's that aspect of production, but to actually get yourself there to do that, there's a lot of things that will go around that, which is like, cooking food, which is putting your clothes on, which is making sure your house is livable. These kind of things, this is reproduction, okay? So these are broadly construed. These are material concerns. These are concerns with your material well-being, okay? And they're constitutive of production and reproduction, okay? So we'll go over these a couple of different ways, and when we look at the different theories who focus on these particular aspects or these ontological frames. But this is what materialism refers to when we talk about it in the social sciences. So again, ontology is about what do we see in the world? We might see there's ideas, there's material things, and another really key one is relations. Okay, so instead of seeing, for instance, like a single person, so if we see, like maybe let's just say, you guys are watching this, you're seeing me, an individual person. So there's some ontological frames which just see people as individuals, and this is kind of the great strength of liberalism, and to an extent realism as well. But liberalism ontology has the person as the ontological, like a reference point, the individual, right? So they look at the world and they see 6 billion individuals, right? And those individuals go around, they act in their own best interest. They might choose to cooperate. They might get in contracts with people, but they bounce around like atoms, right? Serving their best interests. This is an individualistic ontology of the world. Another way of looking at the world is, instead of seeing that person, you looking at things in a relational ontology. You're not just seeing that one person. You're not just seeing me talking at you as just one person. I'm serving my self-interest by talking to you because I'm obviously getting paid. This is how I live. And this is not just, that I'm not just an individual, but I'm actually formed by the relations around me. Okay, so I am only able to do this individual action through the relations that I have with all of you. It's that student-teacher relationship which makes my work of any inherent value whatsoever. The only reason that I'm able to present and record this with you is that I have a relationship with my family and friends around me, which has, given me time, has helped nourish me and, care for me to have the mental capacity to, deliver this lecture, for example. And as well, even if you go even deeper than that, I'm only able to give this lecture because of the relations that I have with the people who made the stuff that I'm giving this through, right? So this laptop that I'm currently speaking into is made by workers from all around the world. Okay, I have a distant relation with them that I can only do what I can do because of their labor and somewhere else in the world. Okay, so this is a relational ontology. Okay, and this is a really key fundamental component of Marxism. Okay, so instead of just seeing the world, seeing individuals, you're looking at relations between individuals. You see the invisible bonds that bind people. Okay, so these are some examples of ontology. So what is there in the world when we look outside? Now, epistemology is, well, how do we know what's there? Okay, so how can we see these things? How can we measure these things? Okay, this is epistemological questions. And this includes something like empiricism. Okay, so this, and you'll see, I think, I might stay away making these connections. So I'd like you to try to think about this. Like, how do the epistemologies that I mentioned link to some of the ontologies? Because these are interconnected, right? They both join together to create theories. So an epistemological approach of empiricism means that we can know the world because of our senses. Okay, so empirical facts that we can see, we can hear, we can touch, we can maybe taste, for example. This is called empirical, like, I guess, an empirical approach. And this is an approach which is common and foundational for natural sciences. Okay, so again, any of you have done natural sciences, they approach the world through things that they can see. We can see these effects of this medication, for example. So this is how we know what happens to it. Okay, but what this medicine does to someone, we know because we can see the changes in that person, right? Or we have, I never did chemistry, but we have a chemical reaction. We know what is there because we can see the molecules. We know the outcome of the reaction because we can see the chemical effects, for example. Okay, so this is about using what you can see, hear, and feel to inform your research or how you see the world. And this is obviously, I think many of you will probably realize, a very common way of knowing the world for everyone. And this isn't just a natural thing. This is actually because of the dominance of the natural sciences in our society. And this goes to social science as well. So empiricism in social sciences is probably one of the most popular or most mainstream ways of doing social science. But it wasn't always. It was only because of the rising popularity of the natural sciences, a couple of hundred years ago. Because previously social sciences was king of the science kingdom, and it was our methodology that led others. But with the rise of natural sciences, empiricism has kind of displaced other methods in social sciences, and especially in social sciences which are done in the United States. They are what you might call crude empiricists. Social scientists there will analyze things that they can see, right? They don't ask questions about like structures, forces, dynamics, things, or relations even, because you can't see them. Okay, you can't see, hear, feel, touch them, so they don't exist to empiricists. So social scientists who employ empiricist epistemology, they record things they can see, for example. Now, there's also lots of different epistemologies, but some other examples might be, for instance, it's a historicism. Okay, so this is when you see something. So let's just say we see this laptop in front of us. An empirical epistemology might be like, we see this laptop, it's there, we know about it because we can see it. A historical perspective, or one informed by historicism, sees a laptop, and it's not always defined based on being able to empirically see things, but considers the historical development of this laptop. Like, where did it come from? What has been its history, right? And this might make a bit more sense if we talk about people. Okay, so empiricists see, like, okay, we see this person here, they have these interests and they'll act in this certain way, for example. Whereas a historical perspective, or in a historic epistemology, will look at a person and their historical evolution, like how did they become what they are today. Similarly, when we think about states, we, historical perspectives will think about their history to try to work out how they will act today. So history is a component of how do we know about things. And another important one is that of a standpoint, epistemology. So standpoint. So how do we know about phenomena, like about things and events? It's through a particular standpoint. So, for example, we might think about relations between two states. some mainstream theories will think about it from the standpoint of the states themselves, right? So they keep it at the level of state relations, whereas other theories might actually put the standpoint in like, a poor person in that country, like how does that affect them? How do these national level international relations deliberations come down and affect that, everyday person just trying to struggle to survive? And this is a classic epistemological approach of feminism. Okay, so the standpoint feminism is where this is quite famous in. So epistemology is about how do we know. So again, just to recap, everyone has a theory. We just have to interrogate what ours is, and then how can we develop it? How can we, make it more resilient, or maybe do we want to change it? How can we understand the world better? And we need to think about what is there in the world, what are we seeing in the world, and how do we know about it? Okay, so this forms the basis of a lot of the theories we're going to talk about. So mainstream theories, I think most of you should have come across in some depth previously. So I'm not going to go into in any detail because it's going to be homework. And so this isn't the homework I was speaking about in the first recording I did. This is homework before our class because I'm a terrible person. And hopefully this shouldn't actually be any real kind of homework for you, but just come prepared when we come to our workshop to talk about these mainstream theories. Okay, so tell me especially about them in terms of like, what's their ontology? What's their epistemology? Think about these two theories of liberalism and realism, and tell me, how do they see the world? What do they see when they analyze international relations, and how do they know about it? Okay, they'll have some similarities, but there'll also be some differences. Now, that's not going to be the focus of the rest of this talk. We're going to be focused on critical theory. Now, why are we doing critical theory? Like I just said, liberalism and realism, the mainstream theories, they're the most popular to use. But we're looking at critical theory because firstly, we're a master's course. Okay, so we're going forward ahead from undergraduate. So the expectations, liberalism and realism are really undergraduate level theories to understand mostly. Like there are obviously some complexities in them, but this is a master's level course, and so we want to challenge you with thinking about critical theories, which are a lot more complex and difficult to understand. And even if you are a diehard liberal or realist scholar or practitioner, then and you have no interest in critical theory whatsoever, it's still very important to try to grapple with the questions that critical theory brings up to strengthen your own theories, right? And also, I would argue that critical theories are very important today because we are seeing more and more evidence of the total failures of liberalism and realism to understand the world, to make sense of the world. As you can probably see today, that international relations, the so-called rules-based order, even the order of international law is totally and utterly kind of wrecked and falling by the wayside. So these perspectives on international relations and world order have really failed us. So this is why I want you guys to think about critical theory and try to understand it and apply it, whether in your own critical theories or in your liberalism or realist approaches. So critical theory is a really, really broad umbrella of a lot of things. And to be honest, like everyone kind of chucks in everything that's not liberalism or realism into it. So critical theory can be understood as kind of encompassing almost everything else. But there's also you'll read some, books or papers or whatever it might be that ascribes critical theory narrowly to, for instance, like the Frankfurt School. Which I won't go into any detail about, but you might see that pop up. We're going to have quite a broad understanding of critical theory. And so I'm going to be introducing to you some of the main strands of critical theory. Like I mentioned in the previous lecture, this will be feminism and talking about the different strands of feminism, looking at Marxism, and then the two major strands of Marxism, which is world systems theory, neo-Gramscianism, and then finally constructivism. So the critical purpose of critical theory is to actually say to liberalism, realism, is that, we challenge the actual like assumptions that you have in your theories. And again, I want you guys to bring your understanding of these theories to us at the workshop, but to play as a bit of a spoiler alert here, is that critical theories will look at something like, liberalism or realism and say, we challenge the basis of your assumption of like the individualistic basis of your philosophy. Okay, so liberalism and realism both look at the individual as like sacrosanct, as the main unit of analysis, whether it's like the person or the individual state. They're like the unit of analysis, right? That's what they see when they look into the world, the ontological basis of their philosophy. But a lot of critical theory will say like, well, it's not just about individuals, it's about the structures that determine their actions, right? Determine the possibilities of what they can even do, and also the invisible forces that we can't see. Okay, so it challenges this normative basis of IR theory that takes the world for granted as it is. Okay, and it asks, who or what is missing from the picture. So one of our very famous neo-Gramscian scholars, Robert Cox, once said that theory is always for someone, and for some purpose, I think may have been the other part of that quote, but it's for someone. So these theories, like liberalism and realism, is to, he would argue, enforce the status quo, or at least demonstrate how the status quo is like normal, is always has been here, or at least the end point of our linear progress of history has arrived at this perfect point where we have liberalism, realism reigning supreme as the only way to understand the world, which is how the world's going to be forever and ever, right? So it's asking like, well, what's missing from that story? Like, how did this history or this status quo actually come to pass? Who has been left out of this? Yeah, and what things haven't we accounted for? So this is a really important question of feminism, and it's classically stated by Cynthia Enloe as like, where are the women? Okay, so women are often missing, very much so, from normative mainstream IR theories. Importantly, too, critical theory asks, well, what's my role in the theory itself? So liberalism, realism, they take what's called an abstracted, fly-on-the-wall view of the world. So they don't account for themselves. They look at the social system and see, empirically see like states interacting, people doing their thing. But they don't account for, well, how does my perspective and my biases, my history actually change what I'm seeing? Like, what impact does that have on what I'm observing? So the critical theories ask, and this kind of comes where the standpoint epistemology comes in. They ask about, well, what do you bring to your understanding of this? What biases do you have? What's your history, and how does that inform how you understand the world? And what's your positionality? So what's your position in structures of power, right? And again, very classic question of feminism. And importantly, critical theory tries to dig down to say, well, what exactly is the world order we have today? And how, can it be changed? Like I said before, there's a lot of evidence that's kind of piling up in the last few years that the world order has firstly failed in a lot of senses, and or is crumbling, and what can be changed about it, and what needs to be changed for the better. So these critical theories seek to answer these questions. They don't always, well, really never actually present themselves as the answer for everything. And I think you maybe have experienced the dogmatism of some of these theories. And this, I mean, the same goes for liberalism and realism too, where they purport to be able to explain everything. Even the very crude Marxism of like the Stalinist kind of era of that people feeling, or Marxists very, orthodox Marxist feeling that they can almost like predict the future based on the Marxist method, which is not something that Marx or any of his followers really ever believed, but it was taken up by like Stalinist orthodox Marxists as the power of the theory. And this is called like dogmatism, that your particular standpoint can totally explain everything, which is not the case. And any real critical theory doesn't make that claim. Okay, so each one of these theories is never a complete explanation of the world, but it just helps us ask some of these crucial questions. So let's get into it in a little bit more detail now. So these are the three theories that we're going to be burrowing into. There's obviously more of critical theories themselves, but we have an intensive course. It's just 6 weeks. We're going to start with like the big ones, which I think too will help us understand more broadly critical theory and its various schools. And we're always going to go back to like, what's the ontology, what's the epistemology, because these are the important things to actually understand the building blocks of these critical theories, which will help you transfer your knowledge to other ones. So let's start with feminism. Now, just like many critical theories, there's not just one school of feminism, right? And I'm going to try to touch on as many of these as I can. But the article that I have for the third reading this week, the required reading, gives you a really nice brief overview of the history of feminism. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail of what this is, but needless to say, feminism was integrated in international relations at a very late stage. Okay, so it was around like the 1980s that feminism as a distinctive school of international relations theory actually entered the broader scholarship. And there's a saying that it's not that feminism found international relations at that time, but international relations finally found feminism, right? Because feminism as a philosophy had been around since, at least the 1800s. With the women's movements of the first and second waves, and then the third, and I think now we're in the fourth wave. So there's a really strong history of feminism activism as well as theory making, which is often excluded in international relations. But feminism, again, is very, very broad, and the feminism that originally entered into international relations in the 1980s was really that of liberal feminism. And I would probably argue that liberal feminism is still the strongest, most definable feminism of IR today. And it's basically a combination, more or less, of liberal philosophy with feminist concerns. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually entails. But the ontology and epistemology of feminism does differ slightly depending on what type of feminism we're talking about. But in terms of ontology, which is, again, if we remind ourselves what ontology is, like what is there in the world? So feminism, different strands of feminism, for instance, might be something as basic as that there's, also women in the world, which is just, or presenting the basic fact to mainstream IR theories that, like, yes, there's women who have been constantly excluded from international relations theorizing. So the intervention that there's women in the world, which is really the starting point of most feminisms, but is almost like the starting and kind of end point of liberal feminism, is a really crucial intervention that was made, just to make that point. But importantly as well, I think a lot of feminist work thinks about what, in terms of what there is in the world, thinks about relations. Okay, so like, for instance, and this, I think this image in the background here of this slide indicates this very well. It's the relations that women have that forms a particular strong standpoint. This goes to the epistemology we'll talk about in a moment, standpoint to understand the world. So women are situated between both spheres of material relations, right? So remember, we spoke about materialism before, where there's this production. So you can see on the side here there's these workers making, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but they're making something, they're producing something, they're creating goods, they're earning a wage. So again, thinking about materialism, they're making things. And this central woman here is divided between production and then also reproduction. So she's dressed in a very stereotypical way, and obviously doing housework at home, looking after a presumably man here. And there's also a child on the floor. So they're also involved in reproduction as well. So this is the women's perspective here ontologically combines firstly the materialist concern of production and reproduction together in one, whereas, for instance, a more masculinist focus on just production relations, which is something that's been accused of Marxism, is just a one-sided overview of social life, okay, where a women's perspective gets both the production, reproduction spheres in materialist ontology, which is about, how do we survive and live our everyday lives. So it sees these two things, but importantly too, feminism also has a concern with relations. Okay, so the relations between, the woman to children, for instance, like the mother-child relationship, the partner relationship, the worker relationship, the familial relationship. There's a way that feminists ask about what's in the world is through relations. So what relations do people have, and how does that also like define power, for example? So like the relation between, let's say husband and wife. Okay, there's historically a historical precedent for an unequal balance of power there. Similarly, like women in the workforce, the relation that they have to their bosses, for example, is an imbalance of power, which is a different relation historically for men in the workforce. Okay, so women usually get paid lower, face more sexual harassment at work, face more discrimination and so forth, and that's because of particular power relation at play. So relationism is also a very important component, and this even goes to the relation of what empiricists take as a given. So even like what a woman is, what is gender, right? So for a lot of like empirical epistemological approaches, which you might call has a crude materialist ontology, sees a woman as, having certain sexual organs, right? And that's what defines that person's gender. Whereas feminists say, that is not the case. That's not what gender is. Gender is about relations, and it's a particular spectrum, for example, which is defined by relations within yourself and outside as well. So this is the ontology, and kind of in that ontological discussion, you can either get an idea of what the epistemology is, which is a lot of it is usually like the standpoint. So the standpoint of the woman, for example, greatly illustrated by this picture, the standpoint of the woman gives a particular perspective which international relations doesn't get otherwise, okay? Because it thinks about these particular questions in such a different way. So this is kind of how we should think about the ontology and epistemology of feminism. And there's a few different schools of feminism. I mentioned liberal feminism before. They are very much related to liberalism in the sense that ontologically, they do see the individual as the most important unit of analysis, or they see the world composed of individuals, right? And so they share that concern with liberalism, but they then also take a feminist standpoint epistemology. So they ask, usually the classic question of liberal feminism is where are the women? So this is the feminism you might be familiar with, which looks at international relations and asks, well, where are the women from the halls of power? Where are women from peace building? Where are women from corporate offices? And the fact that there is gender disparities with women's representation helps to explain a lot of the problems we have in international relations. Now, and I'm being maybe a little bit broad, um, broad in this categorization, but you have like liberal feminism as the major type of feminism in IR, and then the kind of second incredibly broad area is that of critical feminism. And this again, it's also very much defined by other theoretical traditions that it relates to. So like there's like feminist Marxism, feminist constructivism, for example. But we might say that one of the broad concerns of feminism or critical feminism is going much further than just asking like, where are the women? Okay. The ontology that it takes isn't one of the individual unit. Okay. The unit of analysis or what they see is not just the individual, but they see relations between people, between things, so they see power, they see, like love, familial relationships, ties in the community, for example. So that, helps them see things like the production relations, the reproduction relations. So that critical feminism is able to think about, well, are women not represented in halls of power because the very foundations of their work is devalued in the home, right? So women do a lot of, huge amounts of free labor in the home generally, as the social gender divide has it at present throughout the world. That women do a lot of unpaid labor at home, therefore women's labor is undervalued. And so that helps to explain why they're underpaid at work, why there's less women in the halls of power. So critical feminists look at the reproduction and production relationships of women and then thinks about how that then relates upwards to the international level. So there's multi-scalar approach that goes through the household to the nation to the international system. Okay. So this is critical feminism more broadly. And what questions are trying to be answered by feminism? I think, they kind of came through that discussion. It's like not only like where are the women, but like, but why are women discriminated against? Like, why is there this gender divide? And of course, it's not only about women per se, right? So a lot of feminist concerns is obviously about like LGBTIQ plus. It's about a lot of broader gender issues, and not just about women either. A lot of feminist work is actually about men. So about like masculinities, and especially about like what hegemonic masculinity is. How does that play a role in international relations system? How can it help explain the behavior of like male leaders? So feminism is not keyholed into a very like narrow interest area of looking. Obviously it's not a narrow interest area because it makes up half the world's population, but it's not just looking at like women's issues as they might be crudely defined as, but is actually an incredibly broad view of production and reproduction, and gender, which helps explain huge parts of our world. So this is feminism. And again, I think the article of the third reading will really help concretize some of this discussion, and we'll kind of go a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of this in workshops too. So Marxism. And again, many of you, I am very confident to say, probably are aware of, heard of Marxism in some capacity, whether it's in your undergraduate studies, in even newspapers and media, or like people approach you at rallies, for example, who profess to be Marxists. So Marxism is obviously something that most people have heard about. And the second reading for this week goes a little bit more into history, which I think will be a very good refresher for you all. And I'd really recommend having a read of that. But I think, everyone kind of is aware that Marxism, or the body of work of Marxism, started with Karl Marx, maybe I think about 200 years ago now. Now, Marx originally was writing at a time where he was trying to understand the political economy of capitalism at his particular time, which is kind of the around the Industrial Revolution. And so people might ask, well, what can Marxism say about international relations in the 21st century? Which is a very good question to ask. And what we're going to be interested in here is Marx's method. Okay, so his way of looking at the world, and when I say Marx's method, this doesn't mean just Marx himself, but obviously what the huge number of scholars have developed since his time, and how it helps us to understand international relations. Because what I would say to you is that Marx has very, very, very powerful things to say about international relations. And even if you're not interested in Marx from the baseline, for whatever reason, or because you're a die-in-the-wool, liberal or realist, Marx can still help you and push you to develop your theories and to respond to the critiques of Marxism. But Marxism was obviously, or Marx was writing in a particular time, which has obviously changed very much to the present. And one of the important things to realize too in trying to understand the second question that we're going to pose about Marx's ontology and epistemology is like, what was Marx writing to, like, in response of at his time? So he was trying to write a critique of political economy, which was expressed in his, I guess, magnus opus, you might say, Capital. But he is a very, very prolific writer, so don't think he only wrote Capital and the Communist Manifesto. But in Capital, he was trying to critique the political economy system prevailed, as it was prevailing at that particular time. But he was writing in the context of he was German, and he was responding as well to German idealism. So one of his big struggles in life was about critiquing German idealism. And we're not going to go into kind of a huge amounts of detail with this because it's very complex. But it's important just to have a bit of an idea of where his method comes from. So Marx's method is called, broadly, the formal name for it is historical materialism, which tells you immediately something about the ontology and epistemology, right? So remember, ontology, materialism, right, is an ontology. Epistemology, historicism. So this is a combination, historical materialism, of these two components together. And to investigate, the history of our material relations, he employed a theoretical, a kind of, I guess, a more of a method or an approach called dialectics. Again, this is often a very complex thing to think about, but I just want to give you guys a taste of it. And I think, the main reason why I'm trying to do this is that the contribution Marx has to international relations isn't just about class, right? Because I know in your undergraduate international relations at Monash that, they'll usually introduce Marxism. They'll be like, yes, it's concerned about class, and that's kind of it. Like, yes, Marxism is obviously concerned about class, which isn't a groundbreaking thing to say. But the reason he was because that was the conclusion he reached through his particular methodology of explaining the world, and which was based on Hegelian dialectics. So Hegel was a German idealist philosopher who lived just before Marx did, who employed an approach called dialectics. So normally most people define dialectics as a particular way of either argumentation or resolving contradictions, okay? So normally, and this is a super crude way of thinking about dialectics, is that you have a thesis, so you have an argument or a situation, and you have the opposite of it, which is the antithesis, or whatever it might be. And maybe an example of this is like two armies, for example. You have one army here, a second army here, they're against each other. It's a contradiction. It's two unresolvable things, and the dialectical solution is the synthesis, is they come together and there's a synthesis of them both, which creates something new. Okay, so either two armies battling, destroying each other, and something new emerges out of that, or there's two problems that we have which are opposite, right? Two questions in international relations which are opposite ends of the spectrum. They come together and there's a new synthesis. It doesn't necessarily mean the middle or in between them both, but there's something new created. Now, this is a very what's called a you probably use the term vulgar dialectics, right? But the main thing about dialectics really is not the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is what it's usually been reduced to. But it's actually about the relations of parts of a total system to its whole. Okay, so dialectics is focused very strongly on relational ontology. So when Marx had a look at the world system, right, which was defined, still is defined by a capitalist global world order, wasn't quite global in his time, but very much is so now. He was able to see in his analysis how very small parts of that entire system related to the whole. So he looked at, for instance, like a jumper, right? So this is actually, from Capital. He looked at like a jumper, how that jumper was made, who like related to it. So there was like a tailor who made it, which got, who got materials from different parts of the world, put it together, it was consumed, and how those relations and the relations between people in creating and selling that particular commodity tells us something about the broad capitalist system. It tells us firstly about the broad patterns of consumption. It tells us about the drive or the impetus for profit, for example. And it tells us about how commodities circulate in this broader system. So his dialectical philosophy was about connecting the little parts of things that relate to each other. This kind of comes to our, thesis and antithesis of different things that seem opposite, but how they relate to each other in the context of the whole global system. And also how seemingly opposite things have relations to each other, even though you might not be able to see them. And a real classic example of this is that between like lightness and darkness, okay? So they seem totally opposite, right? They have something that's bright, light, you can see it, and another is dark, black, not able to see anything, right? But the dialectical philosophy in looking at two opposites is to say, well, how actually do they relate to each other? And how light and darkness relates is that you can't have one without the other. So how can you know that there is lightness without the darkness around it, right? You can't know darkness without its opposite, okay? So this basic insight helps us see linkages and try to think through connections between opposite positions. And this can also be very useful trying to explain change as well. And so when things change from either like one historical time point to the other, we want to investigate what are the relations between these two historical eras, which explained how that change happened, and to see how they're still linked together. So just because something's moved on to a particular stage, it's still informed by its historical development. And again, another way of thinking about this is if you plant a seed, I know this is quite abstract for international relations, but you plant a seed, it grows into a tree, then a fruit is grown on it and you're picked from it. And the insight of internal relations or dialectical philosophy or ontological relationism, these are all kind of similar terms for the same thing, is the insight that that fruit picked from the tree actually has elements of that seed. Okay, so whether this is, you can say, the DNA of the seed itself is expressed in the fruit. So you can only understand that fruit at a molecular level from the seed, but also relationally, like that fruit, for example, is related to the tree which grew from the seed. So you can only know the fruit through its historical development from the seed. Okay, so these three different stages of this tree's, or the life of this plant is actually all totally internally related to one another. Okay, so again, I know I appreciate this might be I'm also going through this quite quickly, and it's also maybe a little bit difficult to pick up, but I just want to again emphasize to you that the main thing in Marxism is his dialectical philosophy, which, if we just put it down even more simply, is the like the ontology of relationism. Okay, it's about seeing people as individuals. So like you and me, seeing us as like workers, for example, and that we have particular productive relations. Like we have to go and work in our current social system, okay? This little part of us needing to work relates to the broader social system, to these broader structures. So we need to work to be able to have a wage, to be able to pay for, food, shelter, clothes, for example, which through doing so, working helps the employer create profit, for instance, being able to sell things. It helps, for instance, to create consumption demands in the economy, to drive the economy, to create growth in the national economy as well. And then it also creates demands in lots of other subfields, like demands of housing, for instance. So this relational insight, and Marxism, I think, has been, you might say, historically focused on the production relations, helps to explain like how the broader kind of capitalist world system is interconnected. Okay, so every small part of it can be related to the broader whole. So this is the insight of Marxism, is this relational ontology, but it thinks through from the small level up to the big. And this is very, very useful in international relations because it makes us think, well, what is the everyday things that people do which actually informs the broader system, which keeps it going, okay? And these are things we all do. The status quo of what we have today, the capitalist world order, the particular countries, the power that they express and so forth, is only created because of our everyday actions to sustain it, okay? So this is the Marxist insight. It's nothing to do immediately with class, but only class comes out of that thinking, okay? So Marx didn't wake up one morning and be like, wow, I just really hate capitalists and workers are where it's at. Okay, he worked through that method to analyze the world system and came to the conclusion that the working class people were at the bottom of these production relations and we're getting a really crummy deal, okay? And he could see in them, though, the ability for a better future if they were able to take control of their own future and have kind of direction in their production relations and challenge the power relations that those production relationships created, okay? So this epistemology goes towards not only the standpoint of the everyday person in like, ensuring they can eat, drink, go to sleep, wake up, go to work, these material concerns of the individual from their particular standpoint, but also one of history. Okay, so history is a vital point of Marxism, the epistemology or the historical epistemology, which goes back to the historical materialism. So they're concerned about how what we're seeing at the moment relates to the historical development of the various parts of the phenomena. Okay. Now, the questions that are trying to be answered, again, relate to broader questions in critical theory. Okay, so like who has the power? Who gets to decide what's produced in society? And also like how do individuals live? How do they reproduce themselves? These kind of questions. And this also goes to questions of broader world order, which we'll be able to see in different weeks as well. Now, Marxism is a gigantic school. Okay, so again, if someone says there's one right way of doing Marxism, then like walk away from them because they have no idea what they're talking about, because Marxism is hugely diverse. Okay, and I'm going to just talk about two of the main Marxist approach. And of these ones, I'll go a little bit faster in because they have this very similar foundations. Now, world systems theory is a theory which has evolved from the focus of some kind of early Marxists on imperialism. So imperialism being the phenomena whereby we've seen certain countries in certain periods of time being able to project their power from their borders to dominate other countries. So this was the case in Pax Britannica, where Britain was the world power. Now it's the case in Pax Americana, where the United States is the world power. And so in the early 1900s, with theorists such as Lenin and Bukharin, they used imperialism as a way to understand the world. Now, world systems theory grew out of that as a specialty of international relations, which is really promulgated by this character called Emmanuel Wallerstein in the 1970s. He looked at the world system and through kind of the perspective of imperialism saw that there was two major kind of subdivisions of the world. There was the imperial center, so like what we might call the Western industrial countries today, and there was kind of everyone else, or the periphery, where the periphery would make all the raw commodities, like, they'd get all the rocks, like steel, that you need to produce steel and minerals and whatever it might be, and like food stuff, agriculture, and all that stuff from the periphery would be sent to the center, to the central imperialist countries, right? So these structures of power, which were set up, again, using that historical epistemology through colonial relationships, which even though we're in this post-colonial era, all these countries still produce almost the exact same things that they did in the colonial relationships and still supply the so-called global north with the raw materials they need, just as they did in colonial times. And that was very specifically set up that way. And world systems theory integrates that relation between those things coming from the periphery to the center so that we can make all the high high value technology goods, and then we sell it again to the rest of the world, right? And this will always benefit the central what we call the imperialist countries, or the center, because the things that we can make from the raw materials, like I don't know, really crash shot examples, but I guess things like like weapons would probably be a really good examples. Like the weapons that we sell, when I say we, I mean like UK, France, America, Australia, these like the center that they sell to other countries, obviously a lot more valuable than the components that contain to make those weapons. So the exporting countries that export these raw materials will never be able to earn enough money compared to the center selling these high value goods that are produced through these materials, right? So there's always going to be an underdevelopment in the so-called global south because of the structures of the things that they produce and they've been set up to produce since colonial times. So now the ontology here is again about relations, and it's more about the relations between countries. So this is kind of a different, or I guess a higher up focus than Marxism more broadly. But the epistemological approach is, again, still concerned with history, but it is all situated more within the global order of international relations and the capitalist world order. And again, asking quite similar questions to Marxism more broadly. Now, neo-Gramscianism is another subset of Marxism. And this, again, is named after the very famous theorist who started, I guess, asking these questions or theorizing these things, called Antonio Gramsci. And he was the leader of the communist movement in Italy and was put into prison by the fascist Italian state led by Mussolini at that time. And he wrote some very famous books in prison called the Prison Notebooks. And in the Prison Notebooks and his theorizing while he was in prison, because he died after he was very briefly released on medical grounds, he took, again, the fundamental basis of Marxism, but he integrated more we could say broadly, the concerns about ideas. Okay, so Gramsci was one of the very first people who spoke about like ideology. So Marxists before that point didn't see things like ideas, even like religion or other like norms and so forth, as important in determining anything about the world. But Gramsci said, no, actually, ideology and how we think about things is a really core component of, again, something else he pioneered, of hegemony. Okay, so he said that in the global capitalist world order, there's hegemonic forces. Okay, so this isn't just the world system's preoccupation with the what probably would be called like the hegemon, like the one country who's the most powerful imperialist state, like the United States, but it's actually the hegemony of the broader world capitalist system. And this is really illustrated by a really famous quote that says, for us now, it is much easier for us in our like cultural memory, in our like outlook, I guess, on life, to think about the end of the world through some climate catastrophe, through some nuclear destruction, than a change in the world system. Okay, then a change away from capitalism to something else. And this is what Gramsci said was the strength of the hegemonic system of capitalism as a world order. And it was about the ideas, or about the limitations, I guess, of our cultural horizon to see beyond that. And so he theorized about why that was the case. And he looked at the kind of makers of ideas, the influences of ideas, like what he called civil society. So which we might consider now like NGOs, intellectuals, media personalities, people who make what common sense is, make what the status quo sees as normal. Okay, so what's normal to do? This civil society produces these ways of being, of normality, which sustains the hegemony of the world system. So he was very much concerned with ideas. So the ontology of Gramscianism, again, it's about, yes, there's material relations there. He didn't kind of question that aspect of Marxism, but added the importance of ideas into that, which helps forms this hegemony. Okay, because it's not just about, for instance, and this is he's thinking about this in terms of social change, that the global capitalist system doesn't remain what it is because we have like police at every corner beating us into submission, like forcing me, there's not a policeman here just like forcing me to record this lecture to ensure Monash can continue making money, for example. But it's not that coercion, that forced coercion, but it's actually consent. We consent to this system, and to some degree, right? So we consent by getting up every morning and tuning into your lecture to be able to get the skills you need to then get a job, right? To contribute to the system. Like I, sit here and record this because I, want to, right? And this want and this consent is something that is socially created. Okay, it's very deliberately like socially created through social forces, through ideas, through relations with others, that again is informed by our entire history of our own development. So again, epistemologically, history is very important to Gramsci's perspective. Now, constructivism, I won't, this I'll probably spend the least time on because this is the approach that, firstly, I think you have touched on quite a bit before. Secondly, it's one that I'm not as strong on, but also thirdly, too, that constructivism actually and Gramscianism is quite similar. You may have kind of picked that up. Because constructivism ontologically is very much about ideas and more about norms. Okay, so like what's the normative basis of our actions, like like why for instance is it normal that if you walk into a room, you open the door and there's someone just behind you, you're going to hold that door open from them, right? There's no rule that you have to do that. There's no material reason why you'd actually do that, but it's just normative. It's the nice, polite thing to do in our society, right? And similarly at the international level, there's a normative, I guess, well, I mean, it's not normative anymore, but well, I mean, it also still is normative. Like there's a normative prohibition against using chemical weapons, as well as that obviously there's a prohibition now in international law, but there's still a normative prohibition of using chemical weapons, for instance, which places a very strong impetus on nations not to breach that, because if they offend those norms, then there's the risk that they'll be ostracized in global society. So again, there's a lot of we talk about a lot of problems with that particular view of things. And I think, recently we can see that breaches of normative international law and what seems to be right and so forth isn't something that's necessarily going to attract punishment. So these things and constructivists are sometimes caught out in this way. But I guess, again, ontologically, the main thing here is ideas, and epistemologically, like how they can investigate those ideas. Yes, it's not so much about history in constructivism and not so much about ontology as well, but it's kind of like a kind of a normative epistemologically. So we can measure these things through like seeing the effects of these ideas, for example. So this is, a very brief overview of constructivism. It's not a approach that that I use a lot in my own theoretical work, but it is something that obviously comes up and is one of the more major theories in IR. Now, why did we just talk about that? And who cares? Because we're going to be coming back to these again and again and again, and we're going to apply them in our workshops. So, if you just sat through that whirlwind tour of these critical theories and you just think to yourself, my God, what just happened? That's okay. That's perfectly fine. I just wanted to give you a bit of a taste, and really my main goal here was just to kind of hopefully reset your perspectives on some of these critical theories and just start your understanding from the building blocks of them, okay? That's the main thing we really want to do here, is just think, what's the building blocks of these theories, and then go from there. And then through the readings, through our workshop this week, we'll build on those foundations, and then we'll start trying to apply these theories to real world problems. And one of the things I also really hope, I guess, that these discussions more broadly helps us is to think about, well, what are our theories? Again, everyone has one. So I want you to interrogate, how do I see the world? Okay. And just think about, your reaction to world news. Okay. How, what are your opinions on major topics today? This will help give you a bit of an idea of what your understanding or what your underlying theory is. I want you to interrogate that. What is it? And then what are the limitations of that particular perspective? What questions does it answer? But what questions does it miss out? And so, my aspirational goal here is to help or encourage you to even, to scrutinize the way that you think about life. Okay, this is my big goal in APG5091. And I want you to do this too, because like I said before, a lot of the mainstream theories that we've used forever in international relations, like liberalism, realism, there's a real sense that they're failing, okay? Even before the last few years, even before 2020, these theories and because these theories are applied at the highest levels of international relations diplomacy, this is, realism and liberalism is exactly the theories that are employed by political advisors and those near decision makers, that obviously they're failing. We're seeing more conflict in the world. There's, these theories and perspectives can't deal with global problems, it seems, such as pandemics, such as climate changes, and so forth. So we need to start thinking more critically about the world to either maybe strengthen these theories or provide new ways of thinking, because that practical application will be crucial as we go further into the deep unknown. So that is all for the lecture this week. I look forward to seeing you in our first class for week 1. And I hope it'll be enjoyable. It'll hopefully be very active, and we'll do lots of different things. If there's any questions from the lecture, you can either email me, talk to me in class, but in any sense, I look forward to seeing you further online or in person soon. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy until then.